The Aztecs by Nigel Davies. Chapter 4. Moctezuma I. The Empire Takes Shape. Following the death of Huitzilopochtli in 1440, Tlacaelel, continuing his role as leading minister of state, made an unusually stirring speech. Now the light that illuminated you is extinguished, the voice at whose sound all this kingdom moved is still, and the mirror in which all men saw themselves is darkened. Thus, illustrious warriors, it is not fitting that this kingdom be left in obscurity. May another sun rise to give it light. Who does it seem to you to be best fitted to follow in the footsteps of our dead king? Who will preserve for us what he has won? Following this discourse, after due deliberation, Moctezuma was elected as ruler. He is usually known as Moctezuma I, or Moctezuma the Elder, to distinguish himself from Moctezuma II, who ruled when the Spaniards arrived. He also bore the additional name of Ilhuicamina, the Archer of the Skies. The name Moctezuma means the Angry One. He was already one of the 4 inner counselors, from whose ranks the ruler now had to be chosen. As nephew of the deceased monarch and as son of a previous ruler, he was in the direct line of succession. As can be seen from the genealogical table on page 305, it was a fairly common practice for the throne to pass from one brother to another, and only subsequently back to the son of the elder brother. It will be recalled that the mother of Moctezuma was the daughter of the ruler of Cuernavaca, who had been ruled by Moctezuma's father in such romantic fashion, by shooting an arrow containing a precious stone into the courtyard where the princess lay, protected from all suitors by a jealous father. The princess had swallowed the stone, thus conceiving the child that was to be Moctezuma I. It is easy to imagine how deep must have been his attachment to the region of Cuernavaca, from whence his mother came. It was nearby, at Oaxtepec, that he was one day to build his famous gardens, of which some traces can still be seen. Even today, those who live in the chillier and more rarefied atmosphere of Mexico's city still flock at weekends to the balmier lands beyond the mountains, where, as one descends, the rich vegetation bears witness to another and gentler climate, at an altitude intermediate between the high plateau and the hotlands bordering the tropical sea. Nowadays, Cuernavaca is only a little more than 1 hour's drive from Mexico City, but in ancient times the journey entailed a long walk over rugged pathways, rising to 10,000 feet, before descending to the plain surrounding the city. Moctezuma was the ruler who was to break out of the limited territory surrounding the Valley of Mexico and initiate the great Aztec career of conquest that was to take their armies to the shores of the 2 oceans and eventually as far as the present border of Guatemala. During the elaborate ceremonies of his coronation, this truly great ruler perhaps already dreamt of conquests in the Tierra Caliente, or Hotland, that lay beyond his motherland of Cuernavaca, already conquered by his predecessors. For such tasks Moctezuma was singularly well fitted, since he had already played a leading part as commander in the overthrow of the Tepanec overlords, together with his brother Tlacaelel, who was to continue his reign to act as the principal counselor of the ruler. When he acceded to the throne, Moctezuma was a mature man of well over 40, and enjoyed a great reputation both as a soldier and statesman. While the descriptions that survive are less complete than for subsequent occasions, it is clear that the ceremonies which followed Moctezuma's election were much more splendid than for previous coronations, in conformity with the enhanced riches and power of the Mexica. The new ruler was taken forthwith to the temple of Huitzilopochtli, where he was clothed with the royal robes. He then performed austere acts of auto-sacrifice, piercing his ears and thighs with pointed ocelot and ram bones. Many days and nights were occupied with feasting and dancing, attended by numerous neighboring rulers, who gave presents to the new monarch, as well as abundant gifts of clothing to the poor of the city. Conspicuous among these offering gifts and making speeches was Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco. According to most accounts, the rulers of the Triple Alliance had the right of giving formal consent to each other's election once this had taken place. It was customary for a new ruler, when first elected, to conduct a military campaign to show his fitness for the principal task for which he had been chosen, that of making war. On the occasion, the Chalca were to be the chosen victims. They were still unconquered by the Aztecs, though their territory lay not very many miles to the southeast of Tenochtitlan, between the edge of the Great Lagoon and the snow-covered peaks of the volcanoes. Since the early days, when they had played a leading part in the routing of the Mexica in Chapultepec, a traditional enmity had existed between the two peoples. Already in 1376, in the first years of the Mexica monarchy, a long and desperate war against the Chalco had begun, still in effect unconcluded at the accession of Moctezuma. The Chalca had foolishly stood aside in 1428 when the Mexica and their allies overthrew their Tepanec masters. It was, however, to be expected that once the various peoples surrounding the Valley of Mexico had been absorbed into the new empire, this ancient and powerful state, which had already inflicted so much damage on the Mexica and defied them for so long, would stand high upon their list of victims. It is not surprising that Chalco was among the last of their immediate neighbors to be subdued. Now a mere village, surrounded by fertile land and enjoying a special reputation as a producer of cheese and cream, it was in those far-off times not just another city-state, but the head of a powerful confederation. Its chief partner was Amecameca, a town enjoying a unique geographical situation at the foot of the two volcanoes which were over the town, which is still known for its colorful market. In all, the confederation possessed no less than 13 rulers. Thus, because of its relatively greater extent and manpower, Chalco could put larger armies into the field and offer tougher resistance to the Aztecs than any other nearby state. Moctezuma himself knew Chalco and the Chalca well, and was not likely to underestimate their strength. Not only had he been imprisoned there just before the Tepanec War and been lucky to escape with his life, he had also visited Chalco in 1439, a year before his accession, ostensibly to cultivate their friendship. The war itself started in a not unusual fashion. One of Moctezuma's first concerns on his accession was to plan the building of a vastly more sumptuous edifice to replace the older and more modest temple of Huitzilopochtli. He began by sending messengers to all his vassals, instructing them to provide stone and wood. At the same time, he sent a seemingly innocuous request to Chalco, saying that he lacked the very large blocks of stone needed to make statues to adorn the new temple. He would deem it a favor if the Chalca could help to provide these. The customary 4 messengers were sent and were received by 2 rulers of Chalco. The latter gave them an equivocal answer, saying that they could not oblige their freemen to do the work involved, and that in any case they would have to consult their 2 colleagues. When the same messengers returned for a final reply, they were told that, rather than yield to their request, the Chalca preferred war. Moctezuma and Tlacaelel therefore decided to send an expedition of well-armed scouts to the boundaries of Chalca territory. 2 valiant captains were chosen and told to take careful note of any frontier posts or defenses which they saw. These scouts actually found the Chalca forces drawn up and preparing for war. They were so numerous that they covered the whole plain. Matters had meanwhile come to a head between the Chalca and Moctezuma's Texcocan allies. They had actually captured the 2 sons of Nezahualcóyotl. These they proceeded to kill, and their dried bodies were used as candelabra in the ruler's palace. These preliminary moves took place in 1444. The Mexica now made their usual preparations for war, but of a special intensity on this occasion, mobilizing every man and boy capable of bearing arms. The extra effort may have been partly due to an apparent absence of forces from vassal states. The Mexica actually found it necessary to send back observers to watch for signs of disloyalty in Xochimilco and other subject cities, and it is quite probable that they could not be relied upon to fight the Chalca, with whom they had many ties. Naturally, however, the Chalca War was jointly conducted by the three members of the Triple Alliance, and Texcoco played a prominent part in operations. Eventually, when the army of the Aztecs was drawn up and ready for battle, Tlaca LL gave one of his accustomed exhortations. Remember that those who stand opposite are not lions that will tear you to pieces, nor demons who will swallow you. Note well that they are men like yourselves, and that you hold in your hands the same self-arms that they bear. A hard-fought battle ensued, with heavy losses on both sides. It lasted all day, but the Chalca would not yield. By mutual agreements, the fight was then resumed the following day, again with no decisive result. The Aztecs then decided on the adoption of different tactics. To wear the Chalca down, they would limit themselves to light skirmishing for 5 days, making a major attack on the 6th day. This proved highly successful, and the new assault carried all before it. Then a curious episode occurred, typical of the ritual element always present in these wars. The Chalca, seeing themselves in dire straits, asked for a truce, saying that in 5 days they were to celebrate the great feast of their god, Camashli. They would prefer that the final battle should take place on that day in order to have prisoners fresh from combat to sacrifice to their god on that occasion. Perhaps surprisingly, the Mexica agreed, Moctezuma vowing that when completed, his temple too would be dedicated with Chalca blood. For this battle, they then mobilized and armed even boys of 12 years. They were placed at the back of the army to make the Chalca think that they were now opposed by an even greater force. As the Mexica charged, the Chalca called out that their women were wanting to cook them in hot chile. However, undismayed by this admonition, the Aztec forces again carried the day, and the Chalca withdrew, losing more ground. The Mexica took 500 prisoners, who were taken to Tenochtitlan and sacrificed. By now, a point had been reached in the long Chalca War, lasting in all 20 years, by which the Aztecs had already taken much territory, but had not yet captured the main bastions of the Chalca Confederation. Then, at a moment when Chalco was weakened, but by no means prostrate, a kind of truce was enforced by the Great Famine of 1451 to 1454, of which we now shall come to speak, and which struck both foes with equal intensity. As will be seen later, the war came to be resumed after this, but by then the Aztec armies were partly dedicated to distant conquests, a fact which possibly postponed the final defeat of Chalco. The first decade of Moctezuma's reign had now ended, marked at home by the beginning of the Great Temple, while abroad events had been dominated by the Chalca War, still continuing, though other military expeditions must surely have taken place as well. However, in 1450, a 4-year period of famine began, and the nascent Aztec Empire was afflicted by its greatest crisis until the arrival of the Spaniards. As a forerunner of trouble, there was a plague of locusts in 1446. The insects devoured all crops and caused a preliminary period of food damage. This was followed in 1449 by inundations. The level of the lagoon rose until it flooded the whole city. Moctezuma, not knowing what to do, summoned his wise friend Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco, who enjoyed a reputation as a master builder. On his advice, and with the help of other neighboring rulers, a great embankment was constructed as a protection against the waters, measuring 9 miles in length and constructed of large stone slabs brought from a distance of 12 miles. Moctezuma and Nezahualcóyotl initiated the task with their own hands, thus setting an example for the other rulers and their subjects to follow. In 1450, there began a series of very bad harvests. Work had meanwhile continued on the Great Temple, but food began to be so scarce that Moctezuma could give only 1 meal a day to the conscripted workers from surrounding cities. At the commencement of the trouble, there were sharp frosts and a very heavy snowfall, not only on the surrounding peaks, but also on the city itself. Being such a rare occurrence, the effect was disproportionate, and plants and even trees were destroyed and many houses collapsed. This marked only the beginning of a long period of crisis. What actually occurred is most clearly told by Fray Juan de Torquemada. The frosts of the first year of famine came early, as sometimes occurs, and destroyed the maize cobs when they were still green and tender. Not a grain was harvested, and the disaster affected the surrounding country, lying at the same altitude as Tenochtitlan. However, in this year there was no great suffering, as reserves had been carried over from a previous one. In the following year, early frosts again destroyed the maize, then as now a staple diet of the Mexican peasant, and then as now mainly eaten in the form of flat, round tortillas. In the succeeding year, the crops were affected by drought, the other factor which can still adversely affect the harvest in Mexico, particularly if the summer rains start unduly late in the season. As a consequence of this further disaster, there was no seed to sow in the fourth famine year, and it was then that the great catastrophe occurred. The results were not confined to the immediate neighborhood of Tenochtitlan, but were felt in Texcoco, Chalco, and in places lying at a considerable distance. Many actually died of hunger, particularly the elderly. Even the younger people came to look as if they were old, so parched and wrinkled did they become. Vultures, seldom to be found at such altitudes, were everywhere to be seen, scouring for corpses. As might be expected, since the rainfall is more constant in this region and no frosts occur, the lands bordering the Gulf of Mexico, then known as Totonacapan, were not affected by the famine. And by this time, the people of the high plateau were so desperate that they actually sold themselves as slaves to those of the coast in exchange for maize. They presented a heart-rending spectacle as they filed out of their native cities, their necks fastened with wooden yokes. Some who tried to escape died on the way, collapsing under their burdens. Long after that date, a Nahua-speaking population from Tenochtitlan and neighboring cities was found to be in certain places in those regions. Even today, Nahua is still spoken in part of the state of Veracruz, perhaps partly deriving from the migrations of that time. One of the greatest tragedies that occurred was that children were actually sold in exchange for maize, with the rather curious provision that they could be redeemed for the same amount after the hunger ended. The price was 400 cobs of maize for a girl and 500 for a boy. The king and all the other lords wept and sent the people away, no longer able to bear their sorrowful complaints. The people also wept and began to leave the city and go to different places where they thought that they could find relief and where they knew that there were rich people. And there they sold their sons and daughters to the merchants and to the lords of the cities that could give them food. And they gave for a child a very small basket of maize to the mother or father. In return, they agreed to maintain the child for the duration of the famine, with the provision that if the parents wanted to ransom their offspring afterwards, they would have to pay for the food received. The truth is probably that the Aztec Empire was simply not organized to face a calamity of this magnitude. As will later be seen, it was at this stage more an alliance for tribute gathering than an empire, lacking the meticulous organization and the highly elaborate storage systems developed by the contemporary empire of the Inca in Peru. Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan, as well as Nezahualcóyotl in Texcoco, did all they could to relieve the misery and to prevent their cities from becoming depopulated as a consequence. In the first years of the famine, scores of canoes brought maize to the city, which the ruler distributed to the poor in the form of large tortillas, a ration of one to each person. But supplies became increasingly hard to obtain, owing to the widespread nature of the famine, and to the fact that the Aztec Empire did not yet control the coastal lands, which were unaffected. Naturally, the best possible use was made of fish and frogs and of all the varied produce of the lagoon, but there was not enough of this to feed the people. By the last year of the crisis, 1454, Moctezuma's reserves were exhausted, and it was then that the grim events occurred described above. The ruler was forced to tell the people that they must simply fend for themselves and that he could do nothing more to help them. Till now, my sons, you have seen that I have done everything that was possible to preserve you, and that all supplies are now consumed. All that remains is to say that the Lord of the heavens wills that each one of you should now seek his own remedy. After this, the king, weeping bitter tears, dismissed his people. In other words, the imperial system, such as it then existed, had virtually broken down, and Moctezuma was forced to admit it, a calamity which, as will become apparent, was to have far-reaching consequences. In 1455, the rains at last fell in abundance and prosperity returned to the land. The harvests were of record size and the ears of corn ripened as never before. In this year was celebrated the ceremony of the binding of the years, or the new fire, which occurred every 52 years to mark the beginning of the sacred calendric cycle. These last 52 years had witnessed tremendous achievements. The odd cycle had begun in 1403, when the Aztecs, both Mexica and Texcocans, were still vassals of foreign overlords. When the cycle ended, they together controlled a great growing empire, the like of which had not been seen since the time of their Toltec forebears. However, this particular cycle, for all its glories, had ended in temporary disaster. It was therefore with relief, as well as with awe and wonder, that the citizens of Tenochtitlan, yellow and debilitated with hunger, greeted the new year two reed, which had followed the unlucky year one rabbit. The 52-year cycle always began with the year two reed. In their wanderings, after leaving Aztlan, the Mexica had celebrated the new fire 4 times in different places. Since the founding of Tenochtitlan, 2 more new fires had been celebrated, always on a hill just by Culhuacan, now known as Cerro de la Estrella, or Hill of the Star. Some archaeological remains are still to be found there today. The ceremony of 1455 was, in fact, the last occasion on which the binding of the years was to take place before the Spaniards reached the New World. By the time of the next and last new fire, in 1507, the Aztecs and Spaniards were already living side by side on the shores of the Caribbean, though still unknown to each other. As Padre Sahagún relates, after the passing of the year one rabbit, each of the 4-year signs, rabbit, reed, house, and flint, had reigned 13 years, and the full 52 years had passed. When one rabbit, the sign of the south, had fulfilled its task, it delivered its charge to two reed, the sign of the east. Before the hour at which the odd cycle was to end, fires were put out everywhere, and household statues of the gods were cast into the water, as well as pestles and hearthstones. The new fire was awaited with anguish and dread, for, if the fire was not drawn, the sun would cease to shine and the world would perish. This fifth world, known as movement, which, as we all knew, would one day come to an end. Women who were with child were treated with special precaution. They were confined indoors under guard and had to put on masks of agave leaves, as also did small children. It was believed that if the fire was not drawn, the woman would be changed into wild beasts and eat men. Since if the fire failed, the world was to end anyway, a more logical people might have regarded such precautions as superfluous, and the children would be transformed into mice. When the crucial moment came, at the hour when the cycle ended, the new fire was drawn on the Hill of the Star, the priests operating the fire drill on the beast of a well-born captive. As soon as the flame appeared, a priest slashed open the captive's breast and cast his heart into the flame. In Sahagún's words, all remained facing, with neck craned, the summit of Huitzilopochtli, the Nahuatl name for the Hill of the Star, meaning Hill of the Prickly Bush. Everyone was apprehensive, waiting until, in time, the new fire might be drawn. And when a little flame came forth, it was seen from afar. Then all the people quickly cut their ears and spattered the blood repeatedly towards the fire. Although a child still lay in the cradle, they also cut his ears, took his blood, and spattered it towards the fire. Then fire priests, dressed as the different gods, rushed forth. They first rekindled the flame in the temple of Huitzilopochtli. Then they lighted new fires in the houses of the priests, and it was then dispersed to the homes of the common people. This was followed by much rejoicing. Quails were decapitated, and special amaranth seed cakes, spread with honey, were eaten. As was inevitable, especially among a people so given to superstitious practices, such a dire sequence of events as the Great Famine was attributed to the wrath of the gods. And for those who had already practiced human sacrifice on an increasing scale for many centuries past, what remedy could appear more appropriate than to quicken the temple and offer up ever greater quantities of human hearts as food for the gods, in order that they in turn should feed their mortal subjects? To supply this need, we are told that Moctezuma and Tlacaelel, conferring together in their usual fashion, decided that they should establish a system of perpetual war against the cities of the valley of Puebla Tlaxcala, beyond the great volcanoes, and in particular against Tlaxcala and Huexotzingo, in order that both sides should secure for themselves a permanent supply of victims for sacrifice. The intention was not to conquer these peoples, an achievement which would be self-defeating, since no further wars could then be fought with them. Instead, by mutual agreement, a battle would take place from time to time at an appointed place, and prisoners would be captured by each adversary for sacrifice upon their altars. Their gods would thus be suitably appeased. These rituals contests came to be known as wars of flowers. Not only would they offer the advantage of providing a constant source of victims near at hand, without recourse to distant wars, a further important consideration was that such prisoners from neighboring states, sharing the same language and in most cases the same deities, were more acceptable to the gods themselves than barbarian captives from far afield. Furthermore, such wars would provide an excellent training ground for warriors. To reinforce this decision, Moctezuma decreed that henceforth war was to be formally exalted to the principal occupation of the Mexica. Anyone who did not go to war, even the son of a ruler, would enjoy none of the privileges granted to nobles and to warriors. He shall not be permitted to wear cotton clothing, nor plumes, nor shall he be given roses, like the other lords, nor perfume to sniff. He shall not drink cocoa, nor eat fine foods, and shall be regarded as a man of low estate, and shall do the same work that they do, although he be of royal blood. The complex problem of human sacrifice will be discussed in connection with the reign of Huitzot, the greatest of sacrificers. In point of fact, the chronicler's assertion that Moctezuma initiated the War of Flowers hardly tells the whole story. In spite of a certain degree of ferocity that had crept in of late, the long struggle against the Chalca clearly presented elements of a ritual war, and is equally referred to with a certain frequency as a War of Flowers. Contests known by this name also took place in other parts of ancient Mexico. Equally, it would not be altogether accurate to assume that the struggles which now ensue between the Aztec Empire on the one hand and Huitzilopochtli and Tlaxcala on the other were nothing but light-hearted ceremonial affairs. It may well be that on occasions wars were fought with these peoples, mainly for the ritual purpose of obtaining victims for the gods, and were truly wars of flowers. It is also true that all the other Mexican conflicts contained a strong element of ritual. That was one of their troubles when faced with total war on the part of the Spaniards. On the other hand, as will later become apparent, the wars against Tlaxcala were not all mere wars of flowers, and they became increasingly ferocious in the years before the arrival of the Spaniards. The last emperor, Moctezuma II, is several times reported as being reduced to tears by the casualties inflicted on his armies by the Tlaxcalans. In two respects, however, the wars which began at this time, do not indeed constitute a new departure. In the first place, they mark the beginning of a period of continuous hostility and warfare with the peoples of the Puebla Tlaxcala Valley, first mainly with Huexotzingo and later Tlaxcala. These were in part occasioned by the Aztec Gnarled, which resulted in the conquest of the coastal regions and the consequent encirclement of Tlaxcala and its neighbors. Secondly, the steps taken by Moctezuma at this time inaugurated an era of human sacrifices on a much greater scale, amounting to mass offerings as opposed to individual sacrifice, which had already been practiced in Middle America in the fairly remote past, as well as in many other parts of the world. In itself, this mass immolation was a stimulus to greater wars of conquest, since Tlaxcala and its neighbors could not be depended upon to produce all the necessary victims. Though the first decade of Moctezuma's reign was mainly a period of consolidation, his empire had already begun to extend its bounds in a more limited form before the Great Expansion, which began in 1458. It can be seen from map 4 that apart from the major gains to the east and southeast, the empire was also enlarged during Moctezuma's reign to include such places as Atotonilco to the north and Chilapa to the south. It is also quite probable that, well before the main drive to the sea coast, towns lying in that direction had already been absorbed. These lay in an area for which Nezahualcóyotl and his Texcocans were at least partly responsible. Such achievements were of a less spectacular character. It might indeed be the case that Moctezuma, unlike that other great Aztec conqueror Huitzilopochtli, was by nature more organizer than soldier, and that the urge to conquer was stimulated by other events, at a time when he himself was too old to lead his armies, however much in his youth he might have dreamt of attaining personal glory in distant wars. At all events, the great campaigns only took place in his later years, a situation with few parallels among that small class of rulers who were virtual founders of extensive empires. His comparatively slow start in the career of conquest may have been in part due to preoccupations over the Chalca War, but is hardly explained by this alone. In any case, the Chalca War still continued while the other conquests were achieved. In 1450, the Aztec Empire was already extensive by the standards of the times, controlling most of its neighbors, as well as important lands beyond. It probably already exceeded the domain of the Tepanecs, the greatest that men could still remember. In the normal course of events, it is not inconceivable that the Aztecs might have confined themselves to further conquests of a more limited nature. However, if there was one decisive happening to alter this course, it was the Great Famine. In 1454, the empire had been brought to its knees, and a race of conquerors driven to the humiliation of bartering away its children in return for supplies of maize from the unsubjected peoples of the coast. It is hardly, therefore, to be wondered at that Moctezuma's greatest campaign were directed towards the plains of the Gulf Coast, rather than to the much drier lands of the Pacific, only conquered a generation later. After their experiences in the famine, the Aztecs must have hankered after these well-watered lands to the east. Mexico is a land of great climatic variation, but in the whole country there is no contrast so marked as may still be encountered on the road to Veracruz. From an arid and infertile plain, the traveler descends precipitously towards the town of Orizaba, one of the first of the area to be conquered by Moctezuma. Almost in a matter of minutes, the vegetation is transformed, and even the smell of the air and the song of the birds is different. From a stony waste, the land assumes a verdant hue reminiscent of parts of England, were it not for the tropical vegetation, including many mango groves unknown in ancient Mexico. To the Mexica in this country, of which their merchants must have told fabulous tales, was truly a prize worth winning. For a tribe that was the chosen of Huitzilopochtli, and for a people so God-fearing, action cannot spring solely from the search for material gain. Such considerations, however, played their part in the urge to conquer. They were faced with a double need. Firstly, to be able in any emergency such as could always arise on the arid plain to be able to feed their people. Secondly, to obtain the gaudy feathers, the rich jewels, and the fine cloth, which were the perquisites of their nobility. These were at least status symbols, if not essentials, as being their marks of rank or the valor they had displayed in war. Strange as it may seem in more prosaic times, on a supply of such finery the social fabric literally depended. Thus, in 1458, was mounted the first series of a campaign of a far greater scope than any so far undertaken. Moctezuma did not, as might have been logically expected, make his first big push toward the coast, but southeastwards. in the direction of the modern state capital of Oaxaca. The ostensible motive, as for so many Aztec campaigns of aggression, was provided by the killing of Mexica merchants as they came out of the marketplace of Huitzilopochtli. This was one of the main cities of the Mixtecs, a people remarkable for having produced some of the earliest known codices of Middle America, as well as for their very fine gold work and pottery. The best examples of the former can be seen today in the Museum of Oaxaca. Huitzilopochtli was an important commercial center on the road to Oaxaca and to the southeast. That this campaign was undertaken first, before the drive to the Gulf Coast, illustrates the significance which the Aztecs attached their trade with the Mixtec region and beyond. According to some accounts, the passage of their merchants farther south was actually blocked. This was something which they saw themselves forced to avenge, notwithstanding the hazards of fighting a distant and powerful enemy. Moreover, the advantages of imposing actual domination were considerable. Huitzilopochtli, if conquered, would provide a springboard for trade, and possibly for the conquest of the whole Mixtec region and of the lands that lay beyond. For Huitzilopochtli was not just another small city-state, like some that the Aztecs had conquered near home. It actually possessed a mini-empire of its own, and was ruled by a remarkable monarch, Atonal, who himself, like the Aztecs, exacted tribute from a wide area of surrounding territory. At the start of the campaign, the usual muster of Mexica allies took place, but, in view of the distances involved, special emphasis was placed on logistics. Such was the accumulation of tents and field equipment, as well as foodstuffs, that it seemed almost as if they were setting forth to found a city. The journey to their destination, on foot, and using porters in the absence of any kind of pack animal, was long and arduous. However, once completed, they mounted an attack of such fury that their powerful enemy was quickly routed and their principal temple seized and burnt. It was the burning of the adversary's temple that set the former seal on victory in all campaigns. Weary from their long march and eager for vengeance, the Aztecs killed without pity. At this point, as on innumerable subsequent campaigns, the rulers of the conquered people came forth, undismayed by their defeat, and a bargain was eventually struck. By virtue of this, they retained their thrones and continued to rule their people, but as Aztec tributaries, with the obligation to provide specific quantities of tribute every 80 days according to the produce of their district. In this case, the rulers negotiating the treaty did not include Atonal among their number, since the Codex Mendoza shows a picture of him, strangled with a rope, beside his burned temple. Here, as in other places, an Aztec tribute collector was appointed to the district, with a corresponding official in Tenochtitlan to ensure the arrival of the tribute. The task of this local tax gatherer was not to act as governor of the province, but more as a kind of imperial agent, to ensure payment of the amounts stipulated. Then, once the pact had been made, the Aztec leaders and nobles were lavishly entertained and loaded with rich presents, in addition to the tribute exacted, which in the case of Huitzilopochtli included large capes, loads of chile, cotton, salt, and various types of dyestuffs. After the feasting, the victorious army then departed on its return journey, accompanied by long, sad columns of prisoners. These were the children of the sun, destined for sacrifice. However, at the end of their journey, their outward appearance was not so tragic as might have been expected. As they arrived in Tenochtitlan, they actually danced and sang, had been given the sacred pulque to drink, as a solace to their woes. They were then received with special ceremony by the elders of the city, as men dedicated to the gods. Thereafter they filed before the great image of Huitzilopochtli, touching the soil and placing it in their mouths as a ritual gesture of submission. Finally, they were taken to pay homage to the ruler, as the representative on earth of the god. It should perhaps be taken that, apart from this campaign, the chroniclers make mention of another in time of Moctezuma I, actually involving the conquest of Oaxaca, farther to the southeast, and now capital of the region. This is reported to have led to such a massacre of the inhabitants that the Mexica were forced to send colonists to replace the lost population. It may be assumed that some such campaign did take place, but it does not seem that it led to an actual conquest during the reign of Moctezuma I. Having finally disposed of the powerful kingdom of Atonal, the time was at last ripe for the push towards the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, to those fertile Totonac lands where some Mexica had gone as slaves during the famine, and of which they were now determined to become the masters, so that famine might never occur again. Moctezuma first sent ambassadors to Zempoala, that lies north of the modern Veracruz, and where Cortez was to sojourn some 60 years later, in the company of the Fat Chieftain. Substantial archaeological remains are to be found there today, including a pyramid surmounted by 2 temples, typical of Aztec constructions. As usual, the demands were seemingly modest: some large sea snails and other shells that were needed for religious rites, and in order to satisfy Moctezuma's curiosity as to their nature. Again, in this instance, the attack was directed not merely at a single city, but against something more like a confederation. Zempoala belonged to the province of Coahuila, from which, as can be seen on map 4, it lies many miles distant. Ambassadors also went to Orizaba, which belonged to the same grouping of cities. Some leading Tlaxcalans were at that moment visiting this province. As a result of their offers of help, Moctezuma's messengers were ambushed in Orizaba before they ever reached the coast. A few escaped to tell of what had happened. After the usual muster of forces, including, of course, the other members of the Triple Alliance, the army set forth. For supplies, they relied mainly on places on their route, which were threatened with destruction if the inhabitants did not provide these. As usual, the demands were seemingly modest: some large sea snails and other shells that were needed for religious rites, and in order to satisfy Moctezuma's curiosity as to their nature. Again, in this instance, the attack was directed not merely at a single city, but against something more like a confederation. Zempoala belonged to the province of Coahuila, from which, as can be seen on map 4, it lies many miles distant. Ambassadors also went to Orizaba, which belonged to the same grouping of cities. Some leading Tlaxcalans were at that moment visiting this province. As a result of their offers of help, Moctezuma's messengers were ambushed in Orizaba before they ever reached the coast. A few escaped to tell of what had happened. After the usual muster of forces, including, of course, the other members of the Triple Alliance, the army set forth. For supplies, they relied mainly on places on their route, which were threatened with destruction if the inhabitants did not provide these. As a consequence, villages where they passed became deserted. So afraid were the people that they shut themselves securely in their houses and hid away their stocks of maize and chile and their dogs and turkeys, the only domestic animals which existed at the time. The first battle took place against the people of Orizaba, and they went on to defeat the combined forces of the other cities. The Tlaxcalans merely sent good wishes in answer to appeals for help. They were evidently prepared to fight to the last Totonac to avenge themselves of the Mexica. They would have perhaps been better advised to join the forces with the Totonacs, since the Aztec occupation of the coast led to their complete encirclement. As a result, when the Spaniards arrived, they found Tlaxcala deprived of the products essential for their economy. The Totonacs themselves had put up quite a stiff fight, and at one time the Aztecs even contemplated retreat. It was the ruler of Tlatelolco, whose merchants played so prominent a part in trade with this region, who rallied behind the allied forces, saying that if the rest retreated, he would stay and fight alone. As a result of their victory, a large area, consisting of a number of prosperous towns on or near the coast, was added to the Aztec domains. The leaders were taken to Coahuila, the capital of the Federation, and royally feasted. The usual arrangements for payment of tribute were made, and an official left behind to supervise their fulfillment. However, notwithstanding the presence in their midst of Moctezuma's tax gatherer, the people of Coahuila soon thought better of their acceptance of such a burden upon their economy. In this, they were spurred on by the Tlaxcalans, who reproached them for being so ready to pay. The chiefs whom the Aztecs had left in control proved ready listeners to this kind of advice and killed Moctezuma's representative. Instead of the tribute, they gave presents to the Tlaxcalans. The Mexica sent special ambassadors for whom an unusual death was prepared. They were shut in a room by the door of which a load of chile was placed and ignited, emitting fumes that suffocated the envoys. To complete their mockery, the corpses were then stuffed with straw and clothed with sumptuous robes, and much food was set before them. The Totonacs prostrated themselves before these figures, addressing them as lords, and asking obsequiously why they did not eat. When Moctezuma heard of this, his fury knew no bounds. "It is my resolve that the people of Cotashla shall be utterly destroyed, and that no memory of them shall remain." However, his words of wrath were not to be taken too literally. He added a few revealing sentences, expressing his innermost thoughts, evidently directed more towards extracting tribute than revenge. He added that Cotashla would now have to provide mantles twice the length of those supplied before. If previously they had furnished spotted skins of beasts, they would now have to be of pure white. They would even have to provide live serpents as tribute, something they could hardly accomplish if they had been obliterated. Moctezuma ended by instructing his captains to cease to kill and accept surrender if their enemies had laid down their arms. The Aztec armies were again victorious, and many enemies were killed. Then something curious happened, almost unique in the annals of their conquests. We are told that the common people came forth and denounced their rulers, insisting that they themselves had done the Mexica no harm. They then went and found two of these leaders hiding in a cave and handed them over. The Mexica then caused new chiefs to be chosen, and, having imposed double tribute, departed. This was to include such items as very richly worked mantles, as clothing for foods and for lords and rulers, as well as war dresses trimmed with rich feathers, and labrets of crystal with blue smalt mounted in gold. Once in Tenochtitlan, there was some discussion as to how to treat these deposed rulers. Moctezuma hesitated to sentence them because they were lords and made in the likeness of the gods. It might offend the gods and amount to sacrilege if they were killed. It was only at the insistence of the remorseless Tlacaelel that they were put to the sword and then flayed. This step, however, was not at all in conformity with the usual Aztec practice. Normally, they relied heavily on the monarchical principle and the links between royalty and deity in order to maintain their sway over conquered peoples. It was not at all unusual to foment any kind of popular uprising against local chiefs, which might perhaps have had repercussions nearer home. Moreover, the Mexica rulers appeared to have regarded those of other peoples as in the same category as themselves, and to kill them amounted to regicide, if not sacrilege. Another unusual feature of this campaign was that the prisoners were not sacrificed. Whether this was decided upon as a gesture to the common people who had turned against their masters, or whether they were not considered worthy of the gods, we are not told. Instead, the captives were distributed to the nobles, Tlacaelel taking a generous share for himself. The next great campaign took the Mexica armies even further afield. Beyond the conquered territory of the Gulf Coast, and somewhat further to the north, lay the territory of the Aztecs. These people were related to the Maya and possessed an ancient tradition and culture of their own. They even dressed in a distinctive manner and are always depicted in the codices as wearing conical hats, also a distinguishing mark of the flayed god Xipetotec, who had originated probably among the Aztecs and who was specially venerated by them. As on many other occasions, the reasons were partly commercial. The principal cities of the region, Xilcoac and Tuxpan, were important market towns where the people congregated for this purpose every 20 days. Perhaps resenting competition from intruders, they killed visiting Mexica merchants, throwing them off a high cliff. The Aztec armies raised for this expedition first passed through Tuacingo, now a loyal bastion, previously conquered by the Texcocans. Here they were given copious supplies and were regaled with such delicacies as maize cakes stuffed with quails. Victory in this war was achieved by the simple device of an ambush, offering an early example of the use of camouflage in war. 2,000 knights covered with straw were posted on the flank of the enemy line of advance. The Aztecs came forward with painted faces, and gaudily attired in feathers and adorned with jewels, whereupon these knights took them in the flank, and a massacre ensued. After the usual banqueting and bargaining, the Aztecs departed with their train of captives, whose hands were tied behind their backs and necks made fast with wooden collars. Although this was a victory, at this stage it was probably not a conquest in the full sense. These lands were probably too distant to be absorbed as yet into the Aztec domains, which had recently expanded with such astounding rapidity. Further battles were to ensue before they were to be finally subdued by Moctezuma's successors. At the end of this campaign, which was to serve as a preface for others in the same direction, Moctezuma solemnly reaffirmed the Aztec will to conquer, enjoining his people to sharpen their swords for further far-off battles. Mexicans and brave knights of all of my provinces, I wish you to have no illusions that our wars are at an end. We must continue to march onwards. The unfortunate prisoners arrived in Tenochtitlan at a moment hardly auspicious for their own welfare. The date of the feast of the flaying of men was drawing near. It was to be a special occasion this year, owing to the availability of so many captives. The rulers of neighboring states were invited, and fine gifts bestowed upon them. This feast was dedicated to the flayed god Xipe, the special deity of the Aztecs. By sacrificing them to their own deity, the Mexica were indeed repaying them in their own coin. The sacrifices involved were of a very special nature. The prisoners were first dressed in the conventional manner for sacrificial victims, their faces whitened with chalk, feathers placed upon their heads, and with darker coloring round their lips. Each prisoner was then taken in turn by a presiding priest and tied to a rope to a large, flat and round stone. He was given as arms a shield and a kind of wooden club with no blade, but instead covered with feathers. He was also provided with 4 wooden balls made of a light wood as missiles. Finally, to rouse his spirits, he was given the drink of the sacred pulque in a gourd. He raised this 4 times as an offering to the gods before drinking it. The gladiators, who were to be his adversaries, came out one by one. They consisted of 4 knights dressed as eagles and ocelots, the orders to which they belonged. They also were armed with wooden clubs, but these had blades made of hard obsidian. Each in turn was to attack the prisoner. Normally, of course, he succumbed to the first gladiator and was promptly sacrificed, his heart being dedicated to the god. In the extraordinarily rare event of his being victorious against all 4 gladiators, a 5th warrior was sent against him, who was left-handed, and who wounded him in the arm which bore his club. After the gladiatorial sacrifice, the priests flayed the victims and wore their skins as part of the ritual on the feast of Xipe for the next 20 days. In this peculiar form of gladiatorial sacrifice, as in others, the original captor of the prisoner played a very special role. After the sacrifice, the captor took the blood of the victim into a green bowl with a feathered rim. He then visited all the shrines, omitting none, and placed the blood upon the lips of the stone images, using a hollow cane for the purpose, as if giving them nourishment. The captor might not participate in the ritual eating of the flesh of the prisoner. So special was their relationship that he would have regarded this as eating his own flesh. For when he had taken the captive, he had said, "He is my beloved son," and the captive had said, "He is as my beloved father." Such concepts, so alien to the thinking of other peoples, even of the ancient world, serve as a good example of the complexities of the question of human sacrifice, which we shall come to discuss later. Moctezuma's last great campaign, in 1466, was directed against Tepeaca and neighboring cities. This lay much nearer to Tenochtitlan than did the places recently conquered, being situated to the south of the borders of Tlaxcala. However, as a glance at map 4 will show, it was strategically placed in the Aztec military and trade routes to the south and southeast. Probably, therefore, these places had been conquered before, and this campaign was more in nature of a punitive expedition, following a revolt as so often occurred in the rather loose-knit Aztec Empire. Hostilities started in a particularly brutal fashion. The Mexica merchants were not merely killed, but actually thrown to the wild beasts. The usual embassy of 4 was sent, but on this occasion there was to be no parleying. Moctezuma simply sent shield, sword, and feathers as a ritual declaration of war without any further ado. The fact that no resistance was offered adds to the impression that the campaign was undertaken more as a punishment than as an original conquest. The people of Tepeaca and the 3 neighboring towns, thinking discretion would to be the better part of valor, simply agreed to pay tribute and to include Huitzilopochtli in their pantheon. The rulers repaired to Tenochtitlan to pay their homage, and the special charge which Tlacaelel laid upon them underlines the importance of this southern trade. I order you that, since you are situated on such an important highway, you shall pay special attention to ensure that of all who pass, whether foreigner or native born, none shall be ill-treated, nor robbed, nor molested in any way. But that in all your territory you shall take special care to protect the merchants who go to trade in Xoconochco and Guatemala and in all the land, because it is these who enrich and ennoble the earth and give to eat to the poor and to all peoples. To sum up, perhaps seldom until the British came to India was the acquisition of empires so much interlinked with questions of trade and commerce. As Tlacaelel points out, these merchants were already blazing a trail as far as Guatemala, 1,000 miles away. With the Mexica, it was not so much a question of trade following the flag as the reverse. As will later be seen, they were destined to conquer the distant province of Xoconochco on the Guatemalan border, even if they never took Guatemala itself. By the end of Moctezuma's reign, the empire had already taken definite shape, though many far-off provinces were still to be subdued. At this point, therefore, it is timely to ask, what kind of empire was it, and how was it ruled? We have already discussed the government of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, where the general pattern was established by previous rulers. But as the burden of empire began to make itself felt, changes in the central government were inevitable, further consolidating the power of the monarch and the ruling classes, a tendency already perceptible under Moctezuma's immediate predecessor. In the New World, as in the Old, acquisition of empire led to greater concentration of power and privilege. Both military honors and the spoils of war were the perquisites of the few rather than the many. The distinction between ruler, nobility, and common people grew ever sharper. Moctezuma, the great Tlatoani, assumed the remote dignity of an Eastern protenate. He would only appear before the multitude on rare occasions, that the unworthy might not gaze upon his sacred countenance. Only the ruler and his alter ego, Tlacaelel, might wear shoes in the palace precinct. Others must enter barefoot, though a favored few, specially distinguished in war, were privileged to wear sandals in the monarch's presence, but of the simplest kind, unadorned with gold. Moctezuma himself wore different jewels every day, together with the gaudiest plumes and the finest robes. He must have presented a dazzling spectacle as he held council, seated upon his throne, the lower part of which was formed by the skin of a jaguar, with small mirrors inserted into the eyes and teeth, giving the impression that the animal was still alive. Stringent sumptuary laws were enforced, rivaling those of an oriental court. For Moctezuma's subjects, the use of jewels, feathers, and even cotton clothing was governed by meticulous regulations depending on birth and distinction in war. Different styles of dress were to be established for the ruler's counselors, the nobles, the different grades of warriors, and for the people. Death was the penalty for any of the latter who wore cotton clothing, or whose mantle reached to his ankles. If such a one had the temerity to appear in a long mantle, his legs would be examined. If he bore no war wounds, alone considered to justify a garment of such length, he was instantly killed. And thus, when they found someone, a plebeian, who was wearing a mantle longer than what was established by regulation, they examined his legs to see if he had any sign of a wound received in war. And if they did not find any, they killed him. If, on the other hand, they found a wound, they allowed him a longer robe to hide the scar received in the legs as a valiant warrior. Privileges were in part hereditary and in part granted for valor in war. Birth and bravery were two hallmarks of distinction, and considerable differences prevailed between the two. The more splendid finery, such as gold bracelets, headdresses of gold with plumes attached, and the precious greenstone, of deep religious significance and the emblem of the gods, were reserved for the nobility. The distinguished warriors could display simpler baubles, such as the necklaces of bone or small shells, and were permitted to wear the eagle feathers on their heads. The common people, on the other hand, must content themselves with plain obsidian earplugs and with rabbit fur. It was ordained that only the great lords could use lip plugs made of gold and precious stones, as well as nose plugs and earrings. No others should wear these, but the brave captains and courageous soldiers could wear lip plugs, nose rings, and earrings made of bone or wood, or of other baser materials of no great value. It should be emphasized that Moctezuma's work as a lawgiver was by no means confined to court etiquette and sumptuary rules. He issued, in addition, a new legal code governing such general matters as education, religious practices, and festivities, whilst not ignoring such detailed questions as the treatment of adulterers, who were to be stoned and then thrown into a river. Drunkenness was another capital offense. This provision was applied even more strictly to nobles than to commoners. The former were to be killed for a first offense, while the latter were given a second chance before being delivered to the executioner. The severity of the laws on such matters was to astonish the Spanish conquerors. Even certain kinds of theft were subject to the death penalty, though punishment of this crime was generally based on the notion of restitution. For instance, if anyone stole from a temple or private house, he became a slave in that place until he had doubly repaid the loss, once as compensation and once as a fine. Great attention was paid to correct behavior on the part of the judges. And likewise, the ruler chose and placed in office judges who were not noblemen. Such as these, the ruler gave office and chose as his judges the wise, the able, the sage, who listened and spoke well, who were of good memory, who spoke not vainly nor lightly, who did not make friends without forethought, nor were drunkards, who guarded their lineage with honor, who slept not overmuch, but rose early, who did nothing for friendship's or kinship's sake, nor for enmity. The ruler might condemn them to death, hence they performed their offices as judges righteously, for otherwise these judges could find excuse for the wrongs they might do. Moctezuma's provisions for the government of Tenochtitlan, running parallel to those of Nezahualcóyotl and Texcoco, confirmed tendencies previously apparent. What was perforce new was the need to provide for the governing of the expanded empire. It has first to be emphasized that this was not an empire at all in the very strictest sense. The very word empire conjures forth in the imagination a whole apparatus of provincial governors and standing armies to control the subject peoples. In reality, however, the Aztec realm was more an alliance between three powers for the purpose of collecting tribute, to be obtained by predatory expeditions. Continuity of payment was enforced by tax-gathering officials in key places. If their demands were not met, a further expedition was undertaken, dire punishment meted out, and the exactions greatly increased. It was a case of remote control by threat of harsh reprisal, rather than direct government through proconsuls. Nearer to Tenochtitlan and Texcoco, such methods were mainly effective, and a fairly tight hold was maintained. However, recurring rebellions in more remote parts suggest that fear of punishment did not always remove the temptation to revolt. The existing rules of conquered cities normally remained in undisputed control, subject only to payment of tribute. A number of these had in turn their own tributaries, ruling areas where Aztec control was thus even remoter. It might of course be argued that other empires, and notably the British, made similar use of local potentates, and even of subpotentates. The Aztecs, however, tended to keep such rulers on a rather loose rein, and they clearly enjoyed a larger measure of autonomy. They were even free in certain instances to conduct their own campaigns against other peoples, both within and without the empire. Each retained his own fully developed institutions, and only in exceptional cases did the Aztecs impose direct or military rule, and even then more as a temporary expedient. At the time of the conquest, local rulers certainly existed everywhere. Not only did the Spaniards on their marches encounter certain of them, but we have lists of rulers for that moment for most of the territory of the empire. Their persons were held to be, in a certain sense, inviolable. Like the Mexica monarchs themselves, they were the representatives on earth of their own gods. The empire not only lacked local governors as opposed to tax-gathering officials, but equally there is no concrete evidence of the presence of military garrisons of the central power stationed in the provinces, a normal accompaniment of empire in the Old World. As will be seen clearly later, when methods of warfare are discussed, there was no Mexica standing army in the true sense, apart perhaps from the ruler's guard. In its palace, there existed a more limited class of knights and warriors whose main calling was the profession of arms, but who could hardly by themselves have provided provincial garrisons. The Spaniards on their long march from the coast encountered no Aztec forces billeted in distant provinces. It was only after their retreat from Tenochtitlan that they met their armies in the field, clearly sent out from the capital and not locally stationed. What they did, of course, find were the tax gatherers. 5 of these duly appeared in Huitzilopochtli, bearing their curved staffs of office, but armed with no weapon more fearsome than an elaborate fly whisk. Bernal Diaz, however, describes the place as a kind of fortress situated on a hill. The Aztecs may at times have sent a force of their own there, but it was normally guarded by local levies who were tributaries of the empire. Nevertheless, the fiscal control imposed upon such people was strict, and the presence of tax collectors feared. This is made clear by the fact that they dared to appear virtually unarmed. The quantities of tribute, the delivery of which they supervised, was truly vast. At the time of the Spanish conquest, endless trains of porters from far and wide bore to the capital on their extended backs an annual tribute that included no less than 52,000 tons of foodstuffs. An annual total of 123,400 cotton garments was delivered, and, on a less utilitarian level, 33,680 bundles of feathers. At the lower end of the quantitative scale, 10 turquoise masks were received annually and 2 live eagles. All items were carefully checked on arrival, as indeed must have been necessary to ensure that, for instance, 10 turquoise masks did not get simply mislaid beneath the mounds of more general merchandise. It is, moreover, important to appreciate that this tribute in kind was only a part of what the provinces of the empire contributed. In addition, services were exacted in many cases in the form of laborers to build Moctezuma's pyramid and other buildings, as slaves both to work and to be sacrificed, and particularly in frontier areas, supplies and auxiliaries were provided for war. Such places were often exempted from tribute in kind in other forms. One might well ask what purposes of such huge quantities of tribute by the time Moctezuma I, they must have been already considerable, could serve, particularly since such items as the cotton mantles were not permitted to the common people, let alone the feathers. It needs, however, to be borne in mind that, apart from providing for the ruler's large establishment, for the public administration and for the costs of war, the state regularly incurred huge outlays for ceremonial purposes, whether in the form of the elaborate religious festivals or simply as lavish presents, invariably distributed to the visiting rulers to dazzle them with the might of the Mexica. It might be with justice be argued that, notwithstanding the apparent absence of such trappings of empire as provincial governors and garrisons, the Aztecs, like the Romans and others, continually faced certain dangers both from within and without, requiring a greater display of force than could be provided by one city. It should be added that, for the Aztecs, the danger from within not only took the form of local revolts, but also derived from the independent territories lying within the bounds of the empire, and which were never conquered, such as Tlaxcala. Equally, as will be seen, powerful enemies lay without. It would have been virtually impossible for the Mexica alone, or even for the 3 city-states of the Triple Alliance, to dominate such a territory without some system of supplementary alliances. Arising from this need for additional manpower in most of their campaigns, the Aztecs, that is to say, the members of the Triple Alliance, relied in considerable measure on levies drawn from nearby conquered peoples. The text frequently referred to the use in distant campaigns of the people of Chinampa, that is to say, the area surrounding Xochimilco, as well as the people of Chalco, once they had been conquered, and even to auxiliaries from the valley of Toluca to the northwest, and from Cuernavaca to the south. It is, of course, true that these peoples paid tribute, and were therefore second-class citizens, compared with those of the 3 capitals of the empire. but it has already been shown that the Aztecs tended to adopt a conciliatory attitude towards most nearby peoples, once conquered, in comparison with their more distant subjects. Until the empire fell apart under Spanish attack, the former seemed to have remained loyal, and though they paid tribute, they were rewarded for their military aid, since on many occasions they partook of war booty. The basic strength of the empire rested, therefore, upon broader foundations than a mere combination of 3 cities. In effect, it could bring to bear on distant enemies the overwhelming strength of an area with possibly several million inhabitants at the time of conquest. It was not only by virtue of ruthless resolve that the Aztecs overcame their enemies, but by the application of superior force. In addition to the use of nearby subject peoples, certain more distant tributaries seem to have been especially favored, and assisted the Aztec armies with supplies and auxiliaries against their neighbors. The fat chieftain went out of his way to bewail Cortes their cleverness in finding some special friends and favorites among the conquered, who helped to control the remainder. Among these favored few must be considered such cities as Oaxaca, one of the few places which the Mexica actually colonized. This city undoubtedly became a bastion of empire as the Tehuantepec, yet farther to the southeast, on the isthmus which still bears its name. The ruler of this place was given to the daughter of the second Moctezuma in marriage. Equally to be included in this category were a number of frontier posts, which were cities protected by some fortifications, natural or artificial, rather than actual garrisons or fortresses, and were normally guarded by local levies. It may thus be seen that, for control of an area so vast, in comparison with the available means of transport, the Aztecs relied on a radiating system of allies and associates. At the center of the circle, of course, stood the Triple Alliance, as a close combination of these cities. Next, in order, came the circle of associated subjects in the Valley of Mexico and nearby territories. At one remove farther afield were the strong points throughout the empire, based on peoples who, perhaps out of mere enmity towards their neighbors, could generally be counted upon as friends. The outermost circle consisted of actual frontier posts, townships whose people did not pay tribute in other forms, but only owed the obligation to provide for frontier defense. It must also be appreciated that between areas under their control there must have been many a far-off hill or mountain valley where the Aztec armies scarcely penetrated, and where, if their ran at all, it was in remote fashion. Such localities would, of course, normally have paid tribute to a local subject ruler. The very nature of the terrain, so flat and more confined spaces of the Nile Valley or Mesopotamia, militated against total control by the central power. The empire was thus, in many respects, a far cry from certain of those of the Old World, whose meticulous bureaucracies could watch over the doings of the remotest of the king's subjects. It is, however, worth remarking that this more loose-knit type of domain did have its Old World counterparts, whereas earlier rulers of Mesopotamia had built empires in the fullest sense of the word, with a complete apparatus of provincial governors and garrisons. The Assyrians of the 9th century BC really confined themselves to raiding outlying territories and exacting tribute, such expeditions taking place annually. It was only in the 7th century that the Assyrians incorporated the territories thus dominated into a true empire ruled by a central government. The Aztecs, on the whole, seem to have had more control than the earlier Assyrians, since they secured more regular payments. They were not, however, to be granted such a span of time in order to tighten their grip by new methods. It has been mentioned that the innermost Aztec circle consisted of 3 cities of the Triple Alliance, among which Tacuba was a very junior partner. One important question, therefore, still remains to be asked. What respective parts did the 2 senior partners play in the ordering of empire? It was perhaps a special feature of Middle American empires and civilizations that they tended to derive their strength not from one single nucleus, but often from the association of 2 or more peoples, not necessarily of equal strength and significance. What is not always clear is the respective role of each partner. In this, the Aztec Empire is no exception. As far as Texcoco is concerned, not only its greatest historian, himself a scion of the royal line, but also later writers, are such loyal partisans as to insist, not only that Texcoco was equal in all respects to Tenochtitlan, but even that it played a principal part in the earlier conquests. It was perhaps a special feature of Middle American empires and civilizations that they tended to derive their strength not from one single nucleus, but often from the association of two or more peoples, not necessarily of equal strength and significance. What is not always clear is the respective role of each partner. In this, the Aztec Empire is no exception. As far as Texcoco is concerned, not only its greatest historian, himself a scion of the royal line, but also later writers, are such loyal partisans as to insist not only that Texcoco was equal in all parts to Tenochtitlan, but even that it played the principal part in the earlier conquests. In certain things, equality certainly did exist. In particular, by all accounts, the two cities were on the same footing concerning the quantity of tribute received, each getting 2/5 of the whole, while the junior partner, Tacuba, was allotted 1/5. Nevertheless, it is hard for an empire to serve two masters, and it should be borne in mind that, quite apart from sources admittedly partial, less biased accounts insist that Tenochtitlan held the primary in military matters, and even go so far as to suggest that in the councils of war, Texcoco actually obeyed the dictates of the Mexica ruler. And to keep things in their true perspective, it must not be forgotten that it was the Mexica who installed Nezahualcóyotl in his Texcocan kingdom after the joint victory over the Tepanecs. Even the Texcocan historian Huitzilopochtli admits that this only took place 4 years after the war, and during the interval, Nezahualcóyotl remained in Tenochtitlan. Only by virtue of Mexica arms could he eventually succeed in subduing his disloyal subjects. Even in economic affairs, the same source, no Mexica partisan, implies a certain primacy on their part, by virtue of the fact that most of the imperial tribute was first sent to Tenochtitlan, not Texcoco, and from thence redistributed. On the other hand, the Texcocans unquestionably controlled certain territories, including the region surrounding their city, and in addition, a further stretch to the lands of the northeast, around Tulancingo. Equally, many accounts suggest that they drew tribute from a very much larger area, including parts of the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. It must, however, be added that whatever the original situation, Texcoco's sphere of influence was diminished as time went on, and its power greatly reduced. Regardless, therefore, of what territory the Texcocans administered on behalf of the alliance, and notwithstanding their right to undertake certain military campaigns on their own, the Mexica held the final say in military matters. And in a state whose very being centered on the display of valor and the cult of conquest, this was decisive in the final analysis, as the events were indeed to prove. Such considerations in no measure detract from the political significance of Texcoco, nor from its cultural fame. That she enjoyed great renown as a center of learning was in no small measure due to the genial personalities of Nezahualcóyotl and of his son and successor Nezahualpili. As a city ruled by a kind of universal genius, cast in the mold of the Italian Renaissance, Texcoco was perhaps more the Florence than the Athens of its epoch. Like many a Renaissance prince, Nezahualcóyotl's public virtues plead forgiveness of his private failings at moments of like proportion. For instance, he caused one of his sons to be arraigned before his judges because he coveted his son's wife. After his acquittal, and saddened by this unfortunate affair, his eye lit upon the future bride of one of his subject rulers, as she waited upon him at table. When he first gazed upon her, all his melancholy departed, and no sense of fair play deterred him from arranging that the future husband should be killed by the Tlaxcalans in ritual fray. Notwithstanding the existence of many other wives, he then married the princess with elaborate ceremonies, attended among others by Moctezuma. In spite of any such aberrations, Nezahualcóyotl was a remarkable ruler, his greatness residing not only in his fame as a soldier and poet, but equally in his prowess as a builder and lawgiver. It is hard for us to envisage the glories of Texcoco, since the modern town of that name covers the ruins of the old. It is, however, interesting to note that Huitzilopochtli, writing nearly 100 years after the conquest, actually saw his ruined palace, from which he observes that pilferers had robbed wooden supports, left at Nezahualcóyotl's command. Nezahualcóyotl himself, a great poet as well as a master builder, knew that all he constructed with such loving care would one day lie in ruins. In a poem he wrote, I, Nesahuacoyot, ask myself, if perchance we take root of the earth, we are not here for always, but only tarry for a short while. Though it be of jade, it will be shattered. Though it be of gold, it will break. Though it be of quetzal feathers, it will come apart. Nothing lasts forever on this earth, but is only here for a little. In its day, the place was of almost Byzantine splendor. It had 300 rooms, and among its more notable features was the great council chamber, with its throne of gold encrusted with turquoise. Here the monarch would hold court, attended by his more intimate counselors and by subject rulers. The government of Texcoco was not unlike that of Tenochtitlan, and its laws were of like severity. In addition, there were the halls of judgment, of great importance, as well as quarters for the loyal guard. Last but not least, were the rooms for controlling the vast quantities of tribute that fell to the share of Texcoco. The buildings, whose functional and administrative aspects recall the Cretan and Mycenaean palaces, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, occupied a large area interspersed with courtyards and gardens, perhaps the most fantastic part of the whole complex. A special patio was set aside as a kind of university, where poets, philosophers, and historians taught, and close by were the royal archives. The gardens contained many fountains and basins, together with a labyrinth and even a zoo. The latter housed many exotic beasts, but if any species was not available in the flesh, then the gap was filled by a painted stone statue of the same animal. Nesahuacoyot was especially famed for his gardens of recreation. We actually have a description of the large baths which he constructed, supplied by elaborate waterworks, on a hill outside Texcoco, the vestiges of which today are still known as Nesahuacoyot's baths, and which can be reached from the modern city of Texcoco after a short drive and a moderate climb on foot. Of the gardens, the most original and pleasing formed the wood of Texcotzingo, for apart from its large wall, it had steps to ascend to the summit, partly made of mortar and partly hewn out of the rock, and to bring the water from its source to supply the fountains, basins, baths, and pipes used for watering the flowers and groves of this wood, it was necessary to build strong and high walls of stone from one hill to another on an incredible scale, thus forming a water channel which reached the highest part of the wood. It has already been related how Nesahuacoyot helped Moctezuma to build his dike, and as a master builder, the latter did not fall behind his Texcocan colleague. In the great domain that he was creating, monumental architecture was a necessary manifestation of the might of empire. Moctezuma's first efforts were concentrated upon one major undertaking, his temple to Huitzilopochtli. For the purpose, quantities of materials were requisitioned and hordes of workers conscripted from subject neighbors. One can imagine the trains of canoes on the lagoon and the lines of porters on the causeways as they brought every kind of stone from far-off quarries to complete the work, which continued even during the Great Hunger. Our sources, perhaps to dramatize its significance, concentrate their attentions upon this one building, the Temple of Huitzilopochtli. It cannot, however, be conceived as standing in splendid isolation like a single mountain peak. It must have been one of a series of buildings forming a grandiose ceremonial center, such as the Spaniards were to find, and has had indeed existed in one form or another since time immemorial, wherever civilization had taken root in ancient Mexico. Until Moctezuma's day, one may envisage a Tenochtitlan of fairly modest proportions. Inevitably, however, with the expansion of empire came the transformation of the capital. This led to the construction of a whole complex of temples, following the general plan of those which the Spaniards saw, even if, since Moctezuma, the size and number of structures had increased. Most accounts insist that this ruler never completed his temple. It was to be officially inaugurated only in 1487, and the need to enlarge and complete serves his successors as a pretext for campaigns yet more distant and sacrifices more huge. However, mention is also made of this same temple as a complete building in Moctezuma's lifetime, all painted in bright colors with 360 steps leading to the summit, where stood the idol of the god. It therefore appears that little was lacking to finish the structure. Nevertheless, in a sense, no ruler could ever complete a temple of this kind in its final form. Archaeological investigation invariably reveals, as layer upon layer is discovered, not a symmetrical whole, but an untidy maze of alterations, reconstructions, and additions. One has to only walk over the ruins of the great temple of Tlatelolco. This was the pyramid that Cortez actually climbed, to observe that it was extended and superpositions added at least 11 times. The final pyramid covered a vast area and is much bigger than the second, which is what we mainly see. Such major reconstructions must have taken place more frequently than each 52-year calendar cycle. Whereas we are not told of the other structures which Moctezuma built, we do indeed have information concerning certain parts of his great temple, such as the stone for gladiatorial sacrifice which he inaugurated. In addition, he caused a great round monument to be carved, somewhat in the manner of the stone of Tizoc, still to be seen in the National Museum of Mexico City. On its sides were finely carved reliefs relating the conquests which he had made. The amount correctly reminds us that such intricate carving was done with stone instruments. But, like Nezahualcóyotl, Moctezuma perhaps excelled most of all in the making of gardens, and it was these which helped to perpetuate his name. Just as outside Texcoco, we can still visit Nezahualcóyotl's baths, so, at Oaxtepec, not far from his native Cuernavaca, the locality still exists that recalls the memory of Moctezuma and where he built his gardens. It is still today a place of repose, and now houses an extensive rest center of the Mexican Social Security, which exceeds in making imaginative use of the exotic site. The great gnarled cypresses are still to be found along the side of the swift-flowing stream, but little else remains except one coiled serpent of stone near the stream and a toad in the churchyard. However, the church itself is clearly built upon what was once a pyramid platform. It was incidentally under this very church that the Spanish priests were known to bury the smashed statue of the god known as Two Rabbit, one of the many deities of the sacred drink pulque, and who was particularly venerated in this area. The conquerors greatly admired the gardens, even if they were less addicted to the god of pulque, who continued to have his following among the conquered. Bernal Diaz describes him as the most beautiful that he had ever seen. Post-conquest accounts tell of cultivation there of medicinal plants and herbs for use in a hospital built specially nearby. It was towards the end of his long reign that Moctezuma planned his gardens. In order to add to their magnificence and give an air of lush beauty, elaborate works were undertaken to channel the water of nearby streams, to make basins, waterfalls, and reservoirs. Around them were planted every kind of tree and flower brought from the hot lands of the coast. The gardens could not, of course, be inaugurated without intricate religious ceremonies. The actual gardeners who had brought the plants from the coast fasted for 8 days, piercing their ears in an act of auto-sacrifice and anointing the plants with their blood. Using large quantities of ritual paper, rubber, and incense, they made a great sacrifice to the god of flowers that the plants should all grow well and bear fruit. Somewhat to the disgust of the narrator, Padre Duran, these idolatrous prayers were amply fulfilled. And thus it was that, in order to deceive these people, and maintain them in a state of blindness in which some remain even today, our God permitted that for their great sins none of the plants should die, but in the 3rd year they produced flowers in abundance. The account adds information to the effect that they even flowered better than their own native habitat in the coastal regions. Quote, in 1465, as the region drew to its close, there remained one task unfinished. Before leaving an ordered realm in the hands of the prince to be chosen in Moctezuma's place, the final subjugation of Chalco. At the end of the Great Hunger in 1455, the war had continued, possibly rather sporadically. In any case, Chalco was by this time probably sufficiently weakened as to not present a threat to the Aztecs when their armies were absent on distant wars in other parts. They had already previously occupied much territory of the people of Chalco, though not its principal cities. Even the great chronicler of Chalco, Chimalpain, writes of this latter part of the war as if their strength was already ebbing. He uses such phrases as Chalco still fought on, writing in the year of 1458, and for 1463, the war still continued. But now the time was ripe for the final reckoning. After a struggle of some 20 years' duration, and Moctezuma had special reasons for wanting the witness to end. In one of the campaigns against Chalco, 3 of his brothers had been killed. One of his first cousins had also been captured. Rather than sacrifice him, the Chalca wanted to make him their ruler. Disdaining such favored treatment, he offered instead a fine example of Aztec fortitude, addressing his fellow prisoners as follows: "Know well, my brothers, that the Chalca want me for their lord and king. This I would readily be, if they offered liberty to you all. But failing this, I must die like you, since I did not come here to reign, but to fight and die as a man." He was finally sacrificed at the great feast of the fire god. This ceremony was perhaps the nearest Mexican approach to the European maypole, though with rather more sinister undertones. A very high pole was set up and the youths and maidens danced around it, but the Aztec prince was more fortunate than other victims on this occasion. Instead of being burned in honor of the fire god, he simply climbed the pole, danced and sang on a small platform erected at the top, and threw himself down to the ground, where his body was smashed to pieces. In 1464, it was apparent that the war was nearing its end. In this year, the Mexica actually succeeded in storming a hill overlooking Amecameca, the second city of the Confederation. Nowadays, this is known as Sacromonte, since it houses an important shrine. 2 Chalco rulers were killed in the fray. Then there was a lull in the fighting until the following year. By this time, the Mexica were resolved to do or die and never return to their homes till Chalco had been overthrown. They even built huts in the plain facing Chalco, determined to remain there until the final victory. Now at last the omens favored them, and even the owl screech of bleeding hearts and blood-stained throats, referring, of course, to the people of Chalco. Dispirited by such auguries, and certain that the end was near, 3 sons of one of the Chalco rulers preferred to join the winning side, making a timely decision to betray their cause. Guided by these royal traders, the Mexica penetrated the Chalco defenses and their army was routed. Many stragglers were actually driven up the pass between the 2 volcanoes, now known as Paso de Cortez, from the passage of the Conquistador. Some Chalca, including many women, fled to safety by this route over the mountains. The Mexica, anxious to conciliate rather than kill, persuaded them to return. The people of Chalco now declared that they had fought to the last, to the utmost of their ability, and were now resigned to total submission, offering their lands as well as tribute. The Mexica, moved by their tears and entreaties, acted towards them with consideration. Tlaca El addressed them thus: "Brothers, until now we never met with people who could stand up to us like yourselves. Thus it is just, since we are equals in valor, that you shall have equal honor." They were then granted the honors of war, and the emblems due to the brave warriors were bestowed upon them. The rulers were apparently not thus honored, and Chalco was subjected for some time to military government. This story illustrates a major facet of Aztec policy towards the conquered, faithfully respected by Moctezuma. Once near neighbors had been conquered, they were to be treated in a comparatively conciliatory manner, that they might become loyal subjects and useful auxiliaries. After the campaign was over, the Mexica returned home to pay homage to their dead, following for the purpose the peculiar rites prescribed for such occasions. Finding it difficult to mourn fitly without some image of the departed before their eyes, they made wooden mortuary bundles, complete with faces, adding to these eyes, nose, and mouth. They marked these faces with chalk as being symbolic of death by sacrifice. They put feathered devices on their backs and brightly colored mantles on their bodies, attaching shields and clubs to their sides. The relatives then danced before these strange figures to the sound of the music of drums and of instruments made of bone. After 4 days of this celebration, the pinewood bundles known as Lords of Pinewood were burnt. The family of the dead warrior then fasted for 80 days, eating only 1 meal a day. They abstained from washing their faces, which became so filthy after 80 days, as the dirt and dust mingled with their tears, that they looked like demons. Moctezuma knew that his life was drawing to its close, and that his work was done. Accordingly, with his end in mind, he sent out messengers to his father's dominions with orders to seek out the best carvers and sculptors that they could find. They were ordered to carve 2 statues, one of Moctezuma and one of Tlaca El, out of the living rock on the hill of Chapultepec, where the Mexica had first settled on their arrival in the Valley of Mexico. These memorial figures of the 2 brothers were carved so skillfully and with such speed that Moctezuma himself was astonished. This final task completed, He spent his last days ordering the arrangement of his gardens in Huastepec. By any standard, it had been an outstanding reign, and Moctezuma might rank among the great empire builders of history, even though his creation was to come to a swift and tragic ending. He had known tribulations as well as triumphs, particularly the famine. He had overcome them all, but at a price: the increasing tempo of conquest and the mounting toll of sacrifice. As so often happens, victories created their own problems, and the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli were now the prisoners of their own successes. The demands of their gods for yet more victims, and of the state for greater spoils and grander ceremonies, combined to make of conquest a necessity. It is not impossible that such a situation did not altogether conform to Moctezuma's own designs and character. But even the greatest of rulers are not always the master of the events which they inspire. This concludes Chapter 4.